Discovery class, good morning. We're already into the month of July. Here are birthdays and here are anniversaries. That's one of the things we do in our church for you that haven't been to our class. I announce the birthdays for the month, and people can write, they can give them a nice note, or they can phone them. And here are the names. Wayne Alford on the 3rd. John Samala on the 8th. Bert Kachera on the 12th. Bob Lever on the 14th. Ann Kuhn on the 24th. Ruth Steininger on the 26th. On the 30th, Marina Maxwell. And happy anniversary to Ken and Doreen Wing on the 28th. In the history of Brentview Church, we've had leaders down through the ages that have made contributions. And one of the keys to that contribution is how do they communicate? Because we are a people, and it's people that make up a church, and the church is made up of God's Christians. Now, I have a guest with me today that you know. He's been here for the church since 1960, when it was born way back over there in Bridgeland in the center of the city of Calgary. Today, his comments are going to deal with communication. That is, how do you talk? How do you commit yourself to somebody else by speaking? Alvin F. is here with me. Alvin, come. I want you to tell him the story of communication.
Thank you, Father Ron. I had to throw that in. Welcome to our Discovery class talk. Actually, my topic today is on the word listen or listening. Are you listening? How often have you heard that question? I was going to begin my talk with, God, are you listening? But quickly changed it to, Alvin, are you listening? The word listening is actually a very difficult word, punched full of meaning. But the dictionary definition is not very helpful. It simply defines listening as to listen, and then gives examples such as to listen in, listen to. But it is a verb, and thus requires action or involvement. Those of you who knew my wife Jody know that Jody liked to talk. When her son Drew was young, she would say to him, Drew, are you listening? And Drew would reply, Mom, you talk all the time. I cannot listen all the time. Some time ago, I saw a cartoon of a mother trying to dress the little child. And the caption read, Mom, don't talk to me right now. I was up all night keeping you awake, and now I am tired and exhausted. Let me sleep. Today, we live in a world full of busyness and clatter. Many voices shout for our attention. Deadlines to meet, bills to pay, meetings to attend, phone calls to make, emails to answer, children to take care of, etc., etc. So, are you listening? Many years ago at our annual February Teachers Convention, we had a session on active listening. There were some good points, but the major suggestion was to parrot what the other person had said, such as, if I hear you correctly, you said da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, probably some reasonable advice, but for me, it was not my cup of tea. Some 40 years ago, the Calgary Board of Education had a supervisor of business education named Ed Damon, who I got to know quite well. Ed often complained that teachers were not listening to him. So to test his concern, every once in a while, as part of his conversation with them, he would interject a totally nonsensical word, and invariably, the listener would miss the word completely. This is not a new aspect. Even famous people complain that no one is listening. Former President Bill Clinton once said, "Being president is like running a cemetery. You have a lot of people under you, but nobody is listening." In our recent June 26th reading of the daily devotions, the following article was printed. United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt often endured long receiving lines at the White House. As the story is told, he complained that no one paid attention to what he said. So he decided to experiment at one of the receptions. To everyone who passed down the line and shook his hand, he said, "I murdered my grandmother this morning." The guests responded with phrases like, "Marvelous. Keep up the good work. God bless you, sir." It wasn't until the end of the line, while he was greeting the ambassador of Bolivia, that his words were actually heard. Nonplussed, the ambassador whispered, "I'm sure she had it coming." Pastor David Ward did a blog on 1 Samuel 3, 1-21, where he does an exposition of Samuel's call from God. To illustrate his point, he tells the following story. In the early 1900s, when a telegraph was the fastest method of long-distance communication, a young man applied for a job as a Morse code operator. Answering an ad in the newspaper, he went to the office address that was listed. When he arrived, he entered a large, busy office filled with noise and clatter, including the sound of the telegraph in the background. A sign at the receptionist's counter instructed job applicants to fill out a form and wait until they were summoned to enter the inner office. The young man filled out his form and sat down with 7 other applicants, each waiting in the waiting room. After a few minutes, the young man stood up, crossed the room to the door of the inner office, and walked in. Naturally, the other applicants perked up, wondering what was going on. They muttered amongst themselves that they hadn't heard any summons yet. They assumed the young man who went into the office made a mistake and would be disqualified. Within a few minutes, the employer escorted the young man out of the office and said to the other applicants, "Gentlemen, thank you for coming, but the job has been filled." The other applicants began grumbling to each other, and one spoke up saying, "Wait a minute. I don't understand. He was the last one to come in, and we never even got a chance to be interviewed. Yet he got the job? That's not fair." The employer said, "I'm sorry, but all the time you've been sitting here, the telegraph has been ticking out one message in Morse code, which simply said, 'If you understand this message, then come in. The job is yours.' None of you heard it or understood it. This man did. The job is his." Pastor David Bailey, in one of his podcasts, states that listening to God involves more than our ears. He relates the story of a Sunday school teacher who read the story to his class as recorded in Matthew 17:1-5. This passage talks about Jesus taking Peter, John, and James up a mountain to pray. As he prayed, Jesus' face transfigured, and he spoke to Moses and Elijah. At the conclusion of the reading, the teacher asked the boy where Jesus was in the story. The boy answered, "On a mountain." Next question. "Can you tell me why Jesus was there?" The boy answered, "He was there for a math class." "What?" "Yes," said the boy. "Jesus went on a mountain and began to figure." Remember, it said that Jesus was transfigured. Let's not be too hard on the boy. Even Peter got it wrong. Remember, it said he wanted to build 3 tabernacles, one each for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. But God simply said, "Look, Peter, shut up. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." Like the boy in the Sunday school class who misheard and misunderstood the reading of Matthew 17:1-5, I asked myself, am I guilty of inattentional deafness, which is similar to inattentional blindness? There was a research group studying something called inattentional blindness. They stated that inattentional blindness occurs when people fail to become aware of objects unrelated to their current task. In other words, when they are busy doing one thing, they do not see nor notice what is going on around them. The researchers clipped money on a tree branch on a walking trail. The branch was about head height, so no one should miss it. And then they observed the reaction of the passers-by. Result: 396 people were observed walking down the path. Most people failed to see the money because 94% of them were using the cell phone and were so distracted that they failed to see the money. Some did not even see the branch until it whopped them in the face. Cell phones. A wonderful invention, but it has its time and place. I certainly am not trying to pretend to be pious nor self-righteous, but I must admit that I am curious as to what could be so important when I sit in church and I see other people in church on their cell phone during the sermon with their sound off. Turning back to the word listening. To speak or not to speak? That is the question. Is there a right time to remain silent? A Turkish proverb teaches that if speaking is silver, then listening is gold. The Apostle James in James 1:9 advises, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, let every person be swift to hear and slow to speak." As we read through the Gospels, we notice that Jesus used silence and solitude as a consistent part of his ministry, as already mentioned in Luke chapter 9. And in Mark 6, verses 31-32, we read, "And he said to them, 'Come aside by yourself to a deserted place and rest a while.' So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves." The Hebrew word "to listen" occurs over 1,000 times in the Old Testament, Plus, we also have references in the New Testament. I'll just mention a few of them. In John 5:24, we read, "Assuredly, I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life, and shall not come into judgment, but is passed from death into life." Ecclesiastes 3:7. The Bible says there is a time to keep silent and a time to speak. Proverbs 25:11 advises, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a picture of silver." Isaiah 51:1, "Listen to me, you who follow righteousness." Proverbs 29:11, "A fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back." Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." Job 6:24, "Teach me, and I will be silent. Make me understand how I have gone astray." Proverbs 13:3, "Whoever guards his mouth preserves his life. He who opens wide his lips comes to ruin." Proverbs 18:3, "If one gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame." To summarize, as already mentioned in James 1:19, we read, "Therefore, my brethren, let every person be swift to hear and slow to speak." Some closing thoughts as gleaned from Richard Rittenbaugh's book, Bible Tools. He states, "Listening is only half of the communication process. There must be not only someone speaking, but someone must be listening for communication to actually take place. In reality," he says, "the most important part of the communication process is listening, because someone can speak for hours on end. But if no one is listening, what good is it? Even if someone hears, what good is it if they are not actually listening?" Yes, we often hear, but we do not listen. Psychologist Carl Rogers asserts, "Man's inability to communicate is the result of his failure to listen effectively, skillfully, and with understanding to another person." Today, it seems that listening with focused attention is a dying skill and a dying art. Psychologists say that today the average attention span in a college classroom is roughly 15 to 20 minutes. How things have changed. Church sermons used to be 45 minutes long, then down to 30 minutes. Now most sermons are about 20 minutes. So many different factors have come into play. If sermons are televised, cost becomes a factor. The pressures of everyday life also seem to have a bearing. When I was still at school, I found that most teachers hated long meetings because they simply were very busy people. I was sometimes told that all speeches should be given with the presenter standing on one foot. That will keep it short. Now with the internet, things have magnified. Internet researchers are finding that web users have the attention span of a gnat. An average web user has the attention span of about 7 seconds. So you've got to grab them in 7 seconds or so because they go off to something else. Yes, the sound bite has replaced reasoned explanation. Even a commercial at most lasts only a minute. And even at that, to hold the interest, they must change the picture constantly. Thus, it is no wonder that some kids who spend hours watching TV every day, when they end up going to school, they are diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, or other related things. Why? Their brain has actually been programmed to want movement all the time, so they cannot focus on anything longer than a couple of seconds. I realize that this all sounds very negative. I'm simply suggesting a word of caution as to how much time our children should be spending watching TV or being on their computers. On a more positive note, it is important to note that listening by some is also considered as an important spiritual skill. Some even claim that it is as important as a physical skill in that listening enhances human relationships. For example, you cannot keep a friendship for very long if you do not communicate. Theologian William Stringfellow, in his book Friend's Journal, writes, "You cannot listen to the word another is speaking if you are preoccupied with your appearance or with impressing the other or trying to decide what you are going to say when the other stops talking, or are debating on whether it is true or relevant or agreeable. Such matters have their place, but only after listening to the word as the word is being uttered." Actually, he claims that true listening is a primitive act of love, in which a person gives himself to another's word, making himself accessible and vulnerable to the word. Stringfellow also writes, "Thinking of it as an act of love, we can see that listening has a spiritual aspect to it. Just listening to someone else is showing them love. It's showing outgoing concern for what they have to say. Thus, it has a spiritual aspect to it. It's giving one's time and attention to receive what the other person is saying. It may not be important, and it may not have anything to do with anything, but just the act of stopping what you are doing and giving full attention to the other person's word or words is showing them love." I believe Stringfellow has an interesting viewpoint, but I think he overplayed the act of love. I prefer to call it respect for the other person. Thus, we need to listen in such a way that others love to speak to you, and speak in such a way that others love to listen to you. I realize that in this short time, I haven't even scratched the surface of this all-encompassing word. So going back to Matthew 17:5, it states, God says, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." Not just listen with our mind, but seek to understand and to be led by his words and his teaching. Pastor Ron usually ends with a story from the sunny side of the street. Rather than sharing a story today, I'd like to offer a suggestion for men who are listening in. Men, we are sometimes accused by our loved one of not listening. Well, I have a suggestion. The next time your loved one, let's say your wife, accuses you of not listening, rather than trying to defend yourself, turn the table around and use a quote from Alfred Tennyson. And it simply says, "Honey, if I had a flower for every time I think of you, I could walk in my own flower garden forever. I love you." Blessings, and have a great day.